My own research into the topic of great power rivalries is focused on Morocco in the early part of the 20th century. I wrote a book a few years ago entitled Murder in Marrakesh, Émile Mouchon, the French Colonial Adventure. And by virtue of this study, I sometimes think of myself as the world's foremost expert on France in Morocco in 1907. It's therefore something of a relief and a challenge to expand my purview beyond a single year. France has a long history of involvement and entanglement in the Middle East and North Africa, in theory and in fact reality. Some historians begin the history of this engagement with the Crusades and then move on to describe the power struggle between Suleiman the Magnificent, Charles V, and Francis I. More conventionally, historians trace the beginning of the great powers rivalry in the Middle East to Napoleon's 1798 invasion of Egypt. From whatever perspective one takes, the longevity of France's ties to the Middle East and North Africa, coupled with its early colonial experience in Algeria beginning in 1830, is a significant factor. I think it's one that distinguishes that nation's approach to the region and its inhabitants from that of the other so-called great powers. A second distinguishing factor is France's relatively large Muslim populace, primarily drawn from North Africa, but also from the former West African colonies. As the controversies surrounding the headscarf and the veil suggest, the presence of French Muslims within the borders of the Hexagon itself is seen in some quarters as an affront to France's cherished attachment to the principles of secularism or laïcité. This is despite all evidence to the contrary. That is, while some Frenchmen and women from the former colonial empire may be drawn to Islam as the basis of an ethnic identity politics, most are no more religious in the conventional sense than their other French counterparts. Nevertheless, much debate in France centers on how integration of its minorities is to be achieved, a question that has taken on some urgency for the current Sarkozy administration in light of the Banlieue riots of the past decade. While the presence of a large Arab population in France is in one sense a domestic issue, it also has implications on how France conducts its foreign policy, particularly in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Iraq War, and its response to the recent Arab Spring. With these concerns in mind, I will confine my remarks to three themes. First, centers on the aspect of continuity. Despite decolonization, France is still looking for a magic bullet to deal with its population of North African descent. As I hope to demonstrate, la politique musulmane, the Islamic policy as first articulated in regard to colonial subjects a century ago, continues to inform policies being pursued within France itself today. The second theme is the current historiographic trend of looking at the cultural exchange between the colony and the metropole as being multi-directional. While the connection between the colonies and metropolitan France may seem intuitive and obvious, earlier generations of historians did not so readily make this link. And lastly, I want to call attention to the role nostalgia for the colonial era plays in French politics. The legacy of colonization, and particularly France's role in Algeria, remains a hotly contested issue in France today, perhaps in contrast to the amnesia which Peter has mentioned in England. A century ago, France actively began to pursue an Islamic policy designed to reconcile its colonial subjects to her rule. In doing so, French politicians vacillated between two nominally distinct theoretical approaches. The first, exemplified by France's role in Algeria, favored assimilation. Under proper French tutelage, so the idea went, the indigènes, or natives, could rise to the level of European civilization and presumably become Frenchmen. In contrast and in reaction, some colonialists like Niotay, the resident general in Morocco, advocated what was called association. Here the idea was that the French would still provide tutelage, but under the terms of the 1912 Protectorate Agreement, Morocco's social institutions and customs would be respected and protected and preserved. In these two theories, one sees the seeds of the current debate over integration and multiculturalism. The original question, as it was applied to North Africans living in their own lands a century ago, has been relocated, as it were, to their great-grandchildren, who themselves are now relocated in France. A century ago, finding that it had to administer the pilgrimage to Mecca from its colonies and adapt French law to Sharia for its Muslim subjects, the French government offered a characteristically administrative response. In 1911, it created the Inter-Ministerial Commission for Muslim Affairs, or CIAM. The history of CIAM, C-I-A-M, which operated until 1937, is carefully documented in Pascal Le Poutremin, by Pascal Le Poutremin in his book Le Politique Musulmane. Not unlike today's preoccupation with Islamic terrorism, the Commission operated with an eye toward countering pan-Islamism. This concern especially manifested itself during the First World War, when CIAM was responsible for censorship and anti-Turkish propaganda in the colonies. After the war, under the influx of Algerian workers into metropolitan France, the French government found itself attempting to formulate and extend its Islamic policy domestically. Again, characteristically, France responded with an administrative solution, the creation in 1923 of the Service for North African Native Affairs, designed to provide services under one roof to North African workers. The service was subsequently attached to the police as an instrument of surveillance. Other institutions like the Franco-Muslim Hospital ostensibly benefited North Africans by offering medical providers who spoke Arabic and Berber. It too served a surveillance function, as Clifford Rosenberg's studies have documented. More imaginatively, France encouraged the construction of the Paris Mosque, a part of the ongoing efforts to domesticate Islam, or even create a French Islam. France's top-down efforts to reach accommodation with its Muslim minority continue to this day. In 2003, the French government finally roped the heads of competing Muslim organizations to create the French Council for the Muslim Faith, the CFCM, a body somewhat analogous to the consistory, which has represented Jewish life in French officialdom since the days of Napoleon. Despite its self-proclaimed liberalism and tolerance, France is challenged by the concept of diversity. Owing to a system that officially recognizes only individuals, not groups, official France rejects the possibility of a hyphenated identity. Religion only complicates the story for those French citizens whose ethnicity originates in the former colonies, as Gilles Capel and Olivier Bach have discussed in their many books. Being Muslim has become a marker of ethnic identity, taking the place of one's actual geographic origins. On the other hand, many Frenchmen of North African origin seek ties to the old country and actively engage in what could be called transnational politics, a subject studied by anthropologist Paul Silverstein. Equally important to the question of what constitutes a Frenchman is the ever-present notion of laïcité, as embodied in the famous law of 1905 that separated church and state. In 1989, the French government created a new governmental body, the High Council for Integration, specifically charged with promoting secularism. Over the past 2 decades, a succession of official investigative bodies has recommended various programs to encourage the assimilation of France's minorities. Just last year, we saw the release of a report by a special High Commission for the Integration of Communitarianism, whatever that means. More than 200 academics, school teachers, union leaders, and the like testified before this commission. And just this past April, President Sarkozy organized a highly controversial and widely boycotted public debate on the question of integrating Muslims in France. In all these efforts, the premise has been the same. Rather than acknowledging disparate group identities, each with its own history, the focus continues to be on finding a means of effacing differences and encouraging conformity to an idealized, homogeneous notion of French identity. These controversies over identity, a legacy of France's colonial era, predictably have had an impact on the way historians view earlier period.